Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We're happy to have you with us. No matter how you're getting to us here today, of course, video platforms, all kinds of fun stuff. Finishing up a vacation week here for us. It's certainly been a great time, and we're glad to have you with us for it. You know, one of the things we've talked about a lot is there's a lot of newness in store for those of us who are college football fans here in 2024. And one of the new things we perhaps have not given enough attention to, we will talk about that off the top of the program. Perhaps getting ready for your Georgia fan to be forced to embrace a new rivalry. I'll tell you why that might be on tap for Georgia here this year. That plus a game on the Georgia schedule that's maybe not getting enough attention. We'll talk about that there too. So all of that's on the way. We're glad to have you with us. It's DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
You know, I'm like a lot of college football fans that I'm pretty resistant to change. I guess that makes me like a lot of human beings in that respect. And obviously we know for this upcoming season there's a lot of change afoot for college football. One of the things we tried to do is kind of point out, okay, well, this may be a change for the better. This may be a change for the worst. This is just sort of a thing in the middle. We're not really quite so sure what that is in terms of a change for the better or the worse. We just know it's going to be different. And so I think some of what has made the build-up to this upcoming season really interesting is all the ways in which we're about to experience some stuff that we hadn't really experienced before. We talked about this actually exactly a year ago going into the 2023 season of, hey, get ready to enjoy some stuff for the last time. Last chance to own the East. Last chance to, do a good number of things. We knew some rivalries for Georgia would come to an end kind of on a yearly basis. Some of that's already kind of playing out for us, here right now. So we were already gearing up to enjoy some of this for the last time with the thought in 2024, we're going to be enjoying a bunch of stuff for the very first time. And, of course, that's 12-team playoff. That's new format for how the SEC championship is decided. And some new opponents that give us a chance to also, think about Georgia perhaps when it's all said and done, maybe ending this year with a kind of a new rival. And, that's saying a lot because Georgia obviously has a lot of rivalries as a program. That's one of the things that Kirby Smart, I think, has always been really interesting to hear discussed because, Kirby Smart gets asked these questions all the time. Hey, what do you think about Georgia Tech as a rival? Or what do you think about Florida as a rival? Or Auburn as a rival? And one of the things that Kirby Smart already talks about, when you have these rivalry discussions coming up is that Georgia, based on the size of the state, the size of the fan base, the intensity here in the SEC, Georgia just has a lot of rivals. And I was listening to one of these comments the other day from what Kirby was talking about prior to the game against Auburn. Do you remember how Hugh Freeze got himself in a bunch of hot water because, and Freeze is supposed to know the SEC pretty well, but he sort of had kind of a weird way of talking about the Georgia-Auburn rivalry, and the ears of some Auburn fans seem to kind of downplay that a little bit. Kirby Smart kind of came to his rescue a bit while also talking about kind of what it feels like to be Georgia playing in what we think of as kind of a rivalry game. This is what Kirby Smart said about all of that last fall.
Auburn is a border war rivalry. Alabama, Auburn's obviously an in-state rivalry. That's on another whole level of difference from being over there because they live with it 365 days. We share that with several other out-of-state rivalries. There's no diminishing of a rivalry. I tend to agree with Coach Freeze. It's not about hate for me. I don't look at it as I hate any of their players. I recruited a lot of them. I don't look at it as I hate any of their coaches because I like a lot of their coaches. I've known all those guys for a long time. I have a lot of respect for Hugh. I look at it as a hell of a fierce rivalry, and that's really why you do this business. Like why you get in this business is to play in these type games and this type atmosphere. Fan bases may not like to hear that because they like to hate each other. There's not a lot of difference in our fans and their fans a lot of times. I mean, in terms of where they're from, that kind of thing. Our players are similar to their players. So I have respect for them, not hate.
So Kirby says he has respect, not hate. He also says hates games like this when you get into the college football business. And frankly, for most of us, this is also why we love college football so much too. These big games, the intensity of emotion of a rivalry game, that's sort of what it's all about. And, Kirby says there, for the most part in the SEC, your main rivals have been like your sort of border state rivalries, the way that Georgia and Auburn is, or the way the Iron Bowl is, the in-state rivalry between Alabama and Auburn. And obviously Georgia's got its own version of that with Georgia Tech. It's not in the SEC. But for the most part in the SEC, that's sort of what you've had. The close proximity of all the SEC teams, or a huge number of the SEC teams, border rivalries, in-state rivalries. And that's kind of where the "it just means more" thing kind of got born from the SEC. All these schools close by with each other, all kind of fighting for just sort of a level of supremacy within this sort of geographic part of the world we call our own here. And that's sort of what's made the SEC the SEC. But we're getting ready to see a lot of change happen in 2024, and the feeling of all of that is going to be far different than it's been in the past. And some of these border rivalries in future years, maybe they don't get played every year anymore. And some of these, maybe in some cases, even like in-state rivalries, I guess that's a possibility. Those games don't always all get played every year anymore. And so as some of that happens, as that goes down, then there's going to be a little bit of a new way in which I think that rivalries could be determined. In fact, Kirby Smart has talked about that kind of thing a little bit himself there too, going back to last year when, around the same time when the SEC officials get together in Destin, Florida for the SEC spring meetings, there was a lot of chatter this time a year ago around the possibility that Georgia, or I should say the SEC, would adopt a 9-game conference schedule, or as it has now, stick with an 8-game conference schedule. For the most part, the idea of the SEC expanding its schedule anytime soon, that's kind of fallen by the wayside. We don't expect that to occur anytime soon, but it certainly was a big deal this time a year ago. And the subject of some of those rivalry games, like the Georgia-Auburn game that Kirby Smart was just discussing, perhaps not getting played every year anymore. That's certainly something that Kirby Smart was talking about last spring. This is what he said at the time.
I get it, the traditional rivalries, you have 3, you have 2, you have 1, you have this, you have that. I mean, you guys need something to write about bad when you start talking about this. It's just not that big a deal to me, because you have to win your games to advance, right? You need to be in the SEC championship, possibly with an expanded playoff. That's a lot better topic for me. Is somebody going to get an advantage by not going to the SEC championship and making the playoff? That's a lot better topic to me than 8 or 9 games. I mean, I think you got to win your games, and now more than ever, it's going to be that way because it's not going to be divisions. But that's true for both.
What would you think about the Georgia-Auburn game being played every 2 years if it sticks at 8?
It's going to be tough. There's so many people that want that historic rivalry, including me. I was part of that rivalry. I grew up part of that rivalry. I think it's one of the best there is, but I think it's one of the costs of progress, bringing 2 more teams in. It's one of the costs of scheduling, getting more balance in terms of you're going to play everybody. I think that it's not going to just be Georgia-Auburn. It's going to be somebody else for somebody else. Sometimes you call that progress. Sometimes you upset the fan. I think that's a good debate in terms of whether fans, because your traditionalists want those rivalries and others want to see you play the teams they never get to see you play, and you can't have both.
So a couple of things here for a moment. That's one of those older clips from, like, say, last year, and you kind of hear the mic pick up the typing there, the keyboard. I'm always amazed at how hard some of these sports writers are just typing away there. Like, can you imagine banging on a keyboard as hard as some of these sports writers do? How many keyboards do they go through per year trying to keep up? Now, obviously, when you're trying to type as someone's talking, you got to be a court stenographer to be able to do that successfully. So that's not an easy thing to do. But every now and then when the mic will kind of pick up the keyboard typing, and I'm amazed at how fast and how hard some of these, writers start typing and kind of banging it out there. Pretty impressive stuff, I guess. But the more important point is Kirby Smart talks about, hey, progress is going to bring change. And perhaps a rivalry like Georgia-Auburn that's been played every year, it's not going to be played every year anymore. And I think it just stands to reason. I think this point is, I believe, self-evidently true. That if, just to use Georgia-Auburn, for instance, and it could be Tennessee-Alabama, it could be LSU-Ole Miss. There's a lot of rivalries like this for which this could be true, but in this particular case, let's talk about Georgia-Auburn. If Georgia-Auburn doesn't get played every year moving forward, then Georgia and Auburn won't be as big a rivals as they used to be. Is that fair to say? Now, it's still going to be a rivalry. Georgia fans and Auburn fans who live close to each other, especially kind of like down there in Columbus and places like that, they'll still be at each other's throats. But if the two teams are only playing twice every 4 years, they're not as big of rivals as they used to. Are we on the same page as that? Is that fair to admit? Is that fair to acknowledge? And, you can kind of sort of decide how you feel about that necessarily. But it also probably stands to be true that if certain rivalries that Georgia has are about to be lessened because they're not played every year anymore, there's a chance to kind of embrace new rivalries in the SEC too. And I'm not saying this is a change for the better, change for the worse. Maybe it is an example of what Kirby Smart said before about it just being an example of progress. But as the SEC gets bigger, you're not playing as many border states on kind of a per-game basis as you used to, because a lot of these teams now, no matter where you're located in the league, a lot of the league is a long way away from you. If you're Lexington, Kentucky, Norman, Oklahoma is a long way away. If you're Athens, Georgia, College Station, Texas is a long way away. A lot of the league is farther away from you than it once was. You don't have as many border rivalries played on a per-year basis anymore because you're kind of rotating who you're playing. So that means as some of these rivalries start to mean a little bit less, all of a sudden you have a chance to embrace maybe a new rivalry, and before you know it, you've got a pretty good bit of history with a school that prior to this was like 1,000 miles away, and maybe you never had much reason to think about them. I was thinking about that as it relates to Texas for the upcoming season. You guys realize, I know we've talked a little bit about Texas here this week, but you realize that there is a very realistic chance. It's not even a crazy set of occurrences. It's well within the realm of possibility. You realize that Georgia can play Texas 3 times this year? They will play them in October. They will be favored to play each other again in December. Now, obviously, anything can go down there on that. But that's absolutely the two teams that will be favored by the odds makers to play again December in the SEC Championship. We've seen these rematches before. Georgia played Auburn twice in 2017. Georgia played Alabama twice in 2021. So we've seen Georgia play rematches even during the Kirby Smart era a couple of times. But what we have not seen, in fact, I don't know if this has ever happened in college football. I'm assuming it hasn't. What we haven't seen is the same two teams play each other 3 times in the same season. But if Georgia and Texas are both in the SEC Championship, almost certainly they will also both have earned spots in the college football playoff there as well. And, I think Mike Griffith brought this up on the show a couple of weeks ago, that the committee might do what it can to avoid rematches when possible early in the playoff. But, y'all, when you've got so many teams from the same league making the playoff and so many kind of, I guess, sort of unavoidable, kind of advancements for some of those teams, avoiding rematches is not going to be that easy moving forward. And you may just flat out, it just may be the kind of thing that you can't necessarily avoid. That you could be in a situation for the upcoming season where Georgia and Texas, after battling the regular season, and Georgia and Texas, after battling the SEC Championship, could also be forced to battle in the college football playoff there as well. And the sort of weird byproduct of all that is, I don't really consider Texas to be a rival to Georgia right now because the two teams have barely played. Texas has, for the most part, existed in a completely different orbit for the most part for most of my lifetime. But if you play 3 times in the same season, which is a possibility, you better believe you'll have a backstory at that point in time. And backstories are always the birthplaces of all rivalries. This team cost that team a big moment. This team got its revenge, and then the next thing happened. And before you know it, there's a real history here. Even if it's sort of a short history, it's a history nonetheless. And in the future, this kind of may be what Georgia's rivalries are sort of based on. Not to say the other rivalries aren't going to matter, but in the SEC moving forward, geography is going to matter less. This, after all, is supposedly the Southeastern Conference, but you've got Midwestern and Far West, or at least Southwest type teams in this league as it exists right now. And so your rivalries are going to be based on something other than just who you live next to. It's going to be based on who you're competing alongside. And based on the early preseason polls and the projections for who's going to be in the playoff and who could win the playoff, Georgia's competing alongside Texas. And if they do that this season, as much as it seems like they might, on the very long list of rivalries that Georgia already has, making some room for the Longhorns before this year's said and done, you're going to probably need to do that. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We're glad to have you with us. Video, radio, 960 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them. Just really, really appreciate you being here and being a part of our program here today. For those of you watching on YouTube, the other day I asked you this, and you were so kind to do this, and I really appreciate it. I try not to wear out my welcome in terms of things that I ask from you, but I'm going to ask you this again today. Would you mind clicking the like button if you like the show? Would you mind letting people know that you like the show by just clicking that like? For whatever reason, this seems to help that big tech algorithm. I don't really try to pretend and understand too much about that kind of stuff. I just try to do a good show, and hopefully people will find us. But when we can kind of put our thumb on the scale, it probably makes some sense to do that. So would you mind clicking the like button there on that and letting the overlords at YouTube know that people are enjoying what we're doing here, and they'll share it with other people, and they can see that and have some fun with it there as well? It'd be a huge help to us if you do that. Also, our friends at Kroger, thank you so much for making today's show possible there as well. And we're kind of in that sort of graduation time of year, I guess. I think we've still got graduations here coming up. Think about folks getting ready to get out of high school, get out of college. We got kindergarten graduations. You got all kinds of fun stuff like that going on. Of course, everything you need to make that graduate in your life happy, the graduation party success. Kroger.com/graduation to find out more about that. Party trays and gift cards and greeting cards and everything else. Kroger.com/graduation. And you can get everything you need there on that. We're going to get everything we need from UGA recruiting with Jeff Sentell here coming up in just a moment. I'm looking forward to that. Prior to that, though, I want to go around the doghouse. Now, we just talked a moment ago about the notion of scheduling. And we talked about the game that I think has probably gotten the most chatter about any game that Georgia's going to play for this upcoming season, and maybe as much chatter about any game in recent history for Georgia. Georgia, Texas obviously is a very big deal. Going to Tuscaloosa in Alabama is obviously a really big deal. Playoff aspirations for a coach like Lane Kiffin. Going up to Oxford in November, that's a big deal. Georgia, Clemson to begin the season, that's a big deal. There are a lot of big deals for Georgia, in other words, on this schedule here for this year. And because so many of these games feel like such a big deal, you kind of can't help but wonder, does that mean then there are a couple of games that are perhaps flying under the radar a little bit and maybe not getting as much attention as they possibly could get? I think at least one Georgia game perhaps feels that way for me. I'm thinking about the Tennessee game. It's Saturday, November 16th. Tennessee coming back to Sanford Stadium between the hedges for the first time since what went down between these two teams there in November of 2022. The unbelievable atmosphere created by Georgia fans there that day, an unforgettable experience for all of us who attended. And that was just 24 months ago that it felt that big in this stadium between these two teams, Georgia and Tennessee. And I'm not saying it's going to feel that big again this time around, but it's also, to use a double negative here, not going to be nothing either. And to give you a reminder of just how intense it was, remember the compliments that Kirby Smart threw the direction of Georgia fans at the end of that game? I'll never forget them. This is what Kirby Smart said.
What an incredible environment. I just got a text from my wife. I've never seen our fans not leave the stadium like that, even when it rained. You know, Claude made a mention that at the start of the second half, there wasn't an empty seat in the house other than the ones they purchased. And our fans were elite today. We asked them to be. They responded. And they get the second place vote because the players on this team bought in.
You forget how elite the atmosphere was because Georgia won the game so convincingly. There was so much energy prior to the game about whether that would be true. And even this past November up at Neyland Stadium in Knoxville, once again, you sort of forget that was a huge atmosphere for Tennessee. They were really hungry for some, revenge against Georgia, whatever else. Obviously, they didn't get it. They got humiliated there that day. But it was also kind of an intense atmosphere that the last 2 years, Georgia against Tennessee in Athens in 2022 and Knoxville in 2023. Remember the riverboat invasion? That was so much fun. The Georgia-Tennessee game has been about as big an atmosphere as Georgia's played in the last couple of years. And so this year, it seems like that game plays not just second fiddle, but like way, down the trough fiddle in comparison to some of the other big games I mentioned a moment ago. But I think there's a sneaking suspicion that Georgia and Tennessee is going to still matter. It's one of the bigger home games that Georgia plays here this season. No doubt Georgia fans will be ready to be raucous and intense this time around the same way they were 2 years ago. And doesn't it seem like it's kind of flying under the radar here a little bit? I mean, I won't pretend to know exactly how good Tennessee is going to be. We've talked about that topic, among others here this week with our SEC through and our best and worst case scenarios for some of these teams. But I do believe that Nico Iamaleava gives the Vols probably an upgraded quarterback. And, defensively, there are probably a couple of more pieces here than for the Vols than you perhaps realize. That one of the things we think about for the Georgia schedule, in other words, is not the big game that obviously you're in danger of losing, but the way the entirety and the full weight of the schedule just sort of eventually catches up to you after a while. And Georgia will play this game the week after having been at Ole Miss, for instance, and 2 weeks after having played against Florida. And that comes a couple of weeks prior to having played at Texas, and on and on and on it goes. That Georgia's going to be kind of showing you a lot about itself at that point in time, midpoint of November, of just how much it still has left in the tank, how much depth, how much, sort of quality talent is it still putting out there on the field, more so than Tennessee, we would hope and expect. But perhaps a sneaky game kind of flying under the radar. It's not too soon to start thinking about these kinds of things. Georgia getting ready for a very big season and a very, very compelling list of opponents. Georgia, Tennessee getting less attention right now, coming to Athens there in November than some of these other games are. But don't let that fly too far under the radar for you, because that can end up being a bigger game than you realize by the time these two teams get together. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. Now, before I bring on Jeff Sentell, we'll do some UGA recruiting talk with him. Let me remind you, speaking of big games here this year, there are so many of them and so many instances for you to be a part of the action as we do DawgNation Invasion events, partner with our friends at ATL Sports Trips. I just mentioned the Tennessee Riverboat there a moment ago. That's what it looked like this time last year when we got together and did all of that. For those of you watching on video, more fun to be had this year, too. Kicking it all off with the Georgia-Clemson game to begin the season and our DawgNation Invasion tailgate there, just a short walk away from where the stadium is located. That's where we're going to be. A lot of great food for you to enjoy, open bar there that day, entertainment, and the first 250 to sign up also get their chance to get one of these DawgNation Invasion t-shirts. So go to DawgNation.com/tailgate or ATLSportstrips.com. You can be a part of that. Be among the first 250 to purchase your ticket to secure your opportunity at a DawgNation Invasion t-shirt. Now, that's going to be a lot of fun. And ongoing for a few more days, your chance to win our DawgNation Invasion to Austin, our big giveaway here, where someone's going to walk away with a 2-night hotel stay at the DoubleTree Austin University campus, 2 passes to the Friday night football party that's going to be going on, 2 passes to the all-inclusive DawgNation Invasion tailgate, and 2 tickets to the game there as well. So you got between now and June 7th to get registered for your chance to win there on that. So go to DawgNation.com/tailgate or ATLSportstrips.com to find out more about all of that. Great to be partnering with ATL Sports Trips for DawgNation Invasions here this fall. And great to have Jeff Sentell, always partnering with him for really strong UGA recruiting information and a lot of fun there as well. So let's have that conversation here right now, today, as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, great to have Jeff Sentell here. We're going to kind of break with our normal tradition of talking recruiting. I'm going to talk about some other stuff here for a moment. Obviously, we'll get back to that again next week. So that's obviously a lot of fun. And, Jeff, it's worth pointing out, while I'm enjoying some vacation this week, you are also enjoying a little bit of vacation time there as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, man, we're gonna be on one of your favorite ships, Brandon. Got to call it a ship. We're gonna take Royal Caribbean. It's gonna take us through the Inward Passage to Alaska. We're gonna leave out of Seattle. My kids, they didn't want to see beaches this year. They didn't want to see sandy beaches. They didn't want to see the Caribbean. They want to see something different. So we're going somewhere totally different, northern exposure style.
I would love to see that at some point in time. My daughter really wants to do that. I'm not sure when we'll get our chance to do that, but that's amazing. What are you most looking forward to about your Alaskan cruise with Royal Caribbean here coming up?
So obviously the glaciers are going to be really cool. We're hoping to see some whales. And one thing that we've done is we're going to get it's been advertised to me from our family decision maker, Brennan. You know what that means?
Sure.
Our family decision maker, we're going to get we're going to get taken by helicopter to the top of a glacier, and there's going to be a dog sled team that's waiting on us to kind of maybe run as fast as they can around the top of an Alaskan glacier.
Have you ever been in a helicopter before?
Yes, I have.
And that's okay? I mean, it's a little bit different kind of air travel. You're okay with helicopters?
Yeah, it's fine.
That should be a great
Yeah, that's
experience.
fine. We've done those tourist things. Now I got to flip the question around. Are you not okay with helicopters, Brandon?
I don't know. I mean, so I heard through the grapevine that we all think about, Kirby Smart, the Kirby copter. I heard through the grapevine, I can't confirm this is true or not, but I did hear this, is that Kirby may not be the biggest fan of the Kirby copter, that you do that because that's what, it requires to get from place to place. But, when it's windy or something like that and the pilot says we can't do this today, Kirby Smart's like, well, if you don't want to go, I don't want to go either, because obviously, helicopter's a different type of thing there. Now, I can't confirm that to be true. I just heard that through the grapevine that, helicopter travel is just a little bit of a different deal.
Well, I think what's the motto here? What's the mantra? If Kirby wants that recruit bad enough,
that's right,
he'll probably get in a hot air balloon to go get a 5-star defensive lineman or a 5-star offensive tackle.
That's right. Well, listen, I hope you have a great time. I can't wait to see pictures and hear about that. Honestly, it's one of the great things that Royal Caribbean does. Admittedly, I'm sort of fixated on some of the Caribbean stuff because I do like the beach and I love Perfect Day, Coco Cay, and all that. But I know this time of year especially, a lot of people look forward to that great Alaskan cruise with Royal Caribbean, and I think it's kind of a real experience that everybody ought to have. I hope I get a chance to have it at some point in time, and I'm glad that you're going to get that chance to enjoy that, Jeff, and I can't wait to hear more about that when you do. Now, I want to bring you in on the same conversation we've been having with everybody else here this week, and I think it's been really fun. I joked about this as a premise, is that this is the time of year when I take a little bit of vacation that oftentimes I would kind of be putting out my playoff picks and things like that, but obviously when you go from a 14 playoff to a 12-team playoff, doing a full, expansive playoff prediction is a little bit more difficult. So we've said this week we're not quite ready to make our full pick of the 12 yet because there's a lot to navigate with all of that. But we are looking at kind of step one in that for some of the SEC teams, sort of best case and worst case scenarios for those teams. That's included Georgia this week, too, for all of our other guests there as well. So let me bring you in on that, Jeff. If we all assume that, well, the sky is the limit for Georgia, they could go undefeated, they could win the national championship again. What do you think a reasonable worst-case scenario possibly could be for Georgia? If it's as bad as it gets, how bad could it be here this season?
Good question. I'm going to say bad as it gets would involve an injury. Knock on all the wood we can here. An injury at the game's most important position. I'm not going to invoke those names, but I think at that position under center, I think Georgia worst-case scenario with an injury for any significant amount of time. I think Georgia's still a 9-3 team, maybe 10-2 if you tell me that Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins and Ja Jarrett are going to play some ball this year. I think that's the worst-case scenario. I think obviously the best-case scenario would be winning every game, including the last one. And you might see some prolific offensive numbers coming down the track as well, especially at the receiver spot.
Yeah, what we've said is, and you kind of touched on this, that Georgia is more than a touchdown favorite in all of its games, but 3 right now. It's a point spread favorite in every game. If you assume that Carson Beck is as valuable to Georgia as the best quarterbacks typically are to the best teams, that's about a touchdown or so worth of spread value for Beck. So even if the worst thing were to happen and Beck were not able to play, Georgia's still going to be favored to go at least 9-3, and you're still capable of winning a couple of those road games, which you might no longer be a point spread favorite. In other words, if the worst possible thing happened and Beck were to get hurt, obviously Georgia fans hope that's not the case. This could potentially, because of the expanded playoff and because of what Georgia has with guys like Jaden Rashada and, maybe most importantly, Gunnar Stockton, Georgia could still be a playoff team even if the backup quarterback is kind of called into duty here this season.
Yeah, I think that's the depth of Georgia's program, man. I think you're talking about a natty team versus still a playoff team, and I do think there are capable understudies for Beck that are capable of getting Georgia to the playoffs. Brandon, for me, there's just that one game or 2 games every year, no matter how talented, it is a college football staple that you're not going to play your best football. The turnovers are going to be with the other team. You're going to be on the road in the SEC. And we know how Kirby Smart frames that up now. Anytime you can get a win in a hostile environment on the road in the SEC, you take it, especially with everybody gunning for Georgia these days. So for me, that's kind of the way I would kind of couch this season. I think Gunnar can get it done against a lot of these teams. And then you get to the playoffs, but I think you would need an elite arm like Beck to really unlock all those receivers. to maybe beat some of the better teams that will emerge this season.
But what you're talking about is, and this is true for me, presuming that Carson Beck stays healthy and plays all 12 regular season games for Georgia, which is when you play as tough a schedule on paper as Georgia does, even if you win those tough games, the compound interest of doing this week to week to week eventually catches up to you, and perhaps some random game in November ends up being tougher than it would have been, or late October ends up being tougher than it would have been because you have been expending energy in these other tough games throughout the season. That the tough games aren't, just the thing that makes the schedule tougher, but it's all the other games that get more difficult because of what it takes to win these games that everyone currently has circled.
I think, Brandon, I don't know if we tell our audience about this enough. It's the attrition factor of the SEC. You lose a defensive lineman here. You lose your backup safety here, where you have to go to a true freshman there. Now, Georgia, they're playing true freshmen, especially the right true freshman safeties this season. That's likely very much a good thing. But I think that's how you get worn down. You have a lot of guys by that week 13 of the season that are going to be banged up, that are probably going to be operating at about 80, 85, 90% on their best days, because it's an attrition sport. And I think especially after you get like a murderer's row where you would see like a Texas and an Alabama, you throw in a Florida, you throw in a Tennessee, all these big power programs that you're going to come out of it battered and bruised. I think that's part of the factor too about attrition. Brandon, we just saw last year, remember how Georgia had to win games without Brock Bowers? They had to go a lot of times without Kendall Milton. You can just expect on that offensive side of the ball, and even the defensive side of the ball last year with Jamon Dumas-Johnson, Samal Munden is another great example. You can expect, just because it's SEC football, 2 of Georgia's top 15 assets on both sides of the ball are likely going to be dinged up and miss time, because this is still football we're playing.
No, I think that's a good point. So how about the rest of the SEC here for a moment? Obviously, Texas is the team that has the highest projection at the moment. Teams like Alabama and Ole Miss and Missouri are all thought to be preseason top 10 teams. Of outside of Georgia here, who are the other most likely SEC teams in your mind to make a run to the college football playoff? Is it Texas for a second straight year? Is it Alabama kind of picking up right where Nick Saban were left off? Or is it a team like Missouri or Ole Miss kind of getting there for the very first time in program history?
Yeah, good. That's good questioning right there. I would say I'm not gonna be too invested in Texas, because I think they lost a lot and didn't replace a lot. I'm gonna probably, if you want to go best and worst case for Alabama, I would say that a one-loss Alabama team might be the best case, and maybe a 4-loss Alabama team might be the worst case. I just think for the sneaky aspect of this schedule, I like Ole Miss this year, and I like Missouri. I like Missouri because they've been a pretty good program knocking on the door for a while. They've got the requisite DNA to play with the big boys. But I think Ole Miss has got a team with what they've done on the defensive side of the ball. It's funny, I saw the Ole Miss defensive line coach at Milton High School this spring, and man, that guy was smiling pretty big, because I know they have acquired some horses for the stretch run in the SEC. So I really like Ole Miss a lot, because the schedule does them a lot of favors this year. The same for Missouri.
Yeah, I'll say this about Missouri. I'm conditioned to sort of assume, this is a Missouri team that's not going to make the playoff, and I guess in a roundabout way, I think that probably is true. But it's important to know what they have been accomplishing the last couple of years. This is a team that beat Ohio State in a bowl game. This is a team that played Georgia within single-digit margins 2 years in a row. We're one of the only teams to be able to say that over the course of that span. And I mean, we're watching a little bit of video of Eli Drinkwitz right there. The look around Drinkwitz is the kind of guy that he shouldn't be able to get it done at this level, but in a roundabout way, he is getting it done at this level. I like the fact that they don't have the ability to recruit at the same degree that other programs do, so they go out and get a small handful of big-time blue chippers and try to make good decisions about who to kind of pair around that. Whatever Drinkwitz is doing seems to be working, and the possibility that it could work again this year to the tune of making the playoff, especially knowing they don't have to play Georgia this year, you at least have to consider that, don't you?
You do. And then, Brandon, as we watch that video, of the nefarious Eli Drinkowich. I don't know. I just have that in my mind as I watch that video there that our producers are popping up. They've been really close, man. They've been kind of Mark Richt, Georgia, scary close for the last couple of years. And can you imagine, Brandon, in Dog Nation, how despised Missouri might have been if they would have pulled out one or two of those near misses with Georgia? I say near misses because Georgia used to be that near miss program, and Kirby Smart has climbed the mountain on all that stuff. But Missouri, sneaky good the last couple of years. I need to see them replace their run game because they had a horse last year that they brought in. And if they replace that run game, that production, I think they've really, really got something. Again, the schedule matters. Their quarterback's returning. I think a lot of pieces are there for Missouri. They don't get Georgia until maybe later on in the season, maybe the playoff, maybe the conference championship game. So I think this could be Missouri's year because they also have a very special player in Luther Burden.
All right, last thing for you, and it's outside the SEC. And when you look at teams that could make the playoff, I think it's easy to say Ohio State. I think it's easy, to say Oregon. I think that Dan Lanning's got some good things going for the Ducks right now. But, Jeff, I don't know personally if it's necessarily easy to make the case for anybody else. You know, Clemson and Florida State Clemson seems like way worse than they were at their best. Florida State seems like a step back from where they were a year ago. The Big 12 is a total unknown to me right now because of how much has shifted around in that league. The rest of the Big Ten, beyond just Oregon and Ohio State, I would say at least for now, is also a bit of a mystery too. Like, do you have non-SEC teams that you're confident in right now to say, you know what, that's a team that could really make some noise here this season?
Yeah, non-SEC teams. This is not going to shock anybody, but I do like what Oregon's got. I think they'll have a great replacement there with Dylan Gabriel for what they did with Bo Nix. I actually really like this is going to be a shock to no one, but I just know how stocked their roster is Ohio State. And I know that's no shocker to a Georgia fan, man. But, Brandon, I'm hearing that Jeremiah J.J. Smith will be their best wide receiver already this fall. I think they'll get a little bit better quarterback play this year than they got last year with Kyle McCord. And what they did through NIL, Brandon, my impression of that story is they found a way to keep a lot of their guys on the defensive side of the ball that may have been round 2, round 3, round 4 picks. They found a way, whether through NIL or just stubbornness about finally wanting to beat that Michigan team. I think this is the year, Brandon, that if that man right there, Ryan Day, doesn't win it, his seat should be global, thermonuclear hot, and probably there might even be a change in Columbus. That's why they've loaded up so much for this season.
Jeff, it's a fascinating conversation. I'm glad to have it with you. Of course, next week we'll look forward to getting back to our regular recruiting chatter. Hope you enjoy a great vacation. Come back and show us some pictures of Royal Caribbean there in Alaska, and we will look forward to talking to you soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
Thanks, buddy. Be well.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Boy, good stuff from Jeff Sentell there, and we certainly hope he enjoys his Royal Caribbean cruise vacation that he's getting a chance to take this week. Obviously, for me, when I'm taking these Royal Caribbean cruise vacations, typically speaking, I'm enjoying the Caribbean and things like that, but I certainly love the fact that Jeff's heading towards Alaska, and ultimately that's something I'd love to do there as well. Many of you have kind of done that, and you've told us some great things about that. So keep Alaska as a destination in mind for your Royal Caribbean cruise vacation needs. And maybe one of these days I'll get a chance to do that. And we'll certainly look forward to hearing plenty from Jeff Sentell about his own experience there with that. Now, speaking of Royal Caribbean, let's cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And one of the things I think is really fun is, we've seen Utopia of the Seas be constructed right here before our very eyes. And it's always kind of neat when you kind of get to that time in which you kind of leave the shipyard where it's being built. And I know that Utopia spent a couple of days over in France, and now it's getting ready to start making its way over to Port Canaveral and eventually be in Port Canaveral. What's amazing is they actually moved up the inaugural sailing. A lot of people, they love to be on the very first sailing. I'm kind of like one of those people too. I kind of like to be among the first if I possibly can. And the inaugural sailing for Utopia of the Seas actually got moved up a little bit just because they built it ahead of schedule, which is always kind of a cool thing. And if you're watching on video, you see all that goes into that. And it's obviously a massive, massive vessel. And, so much great care is taken to make sure all the entertainment spaces look exactly the way that they're supposed to look and create the vibe they're supposed to to create here, and so many cool new things on board Utopia of the Seas there as well. So it's going to be a wonderful experience. If you want your own opportunity on board, much like I'm going to have coming up in July, Jessica Slater can help you out with that. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com, and she can tell you about all of that. So by now you know our format for our cruising around the SEC here this week. We're looking at best case, worst case scenarios for a lot of the top SEC teams, the teams with playoff aspirations, the teams in some cases who are just trying to be better than they were a year ago. I want to start with Ole Miss here. And this is a team that is expected to be in the college football playoff. Because when you look at teams like Missouri, teams like Ole Miss are kind of in that similar spot. Pretty good a season ago. If there had been a 12-team playoff, they would have been in it. I would say that we've heard a little more in the way of positivity around Ole Miss this offseason than we've heard for Eli Drinkwitz in Missouri. Is that well-placed? Is it well-founded? I guess we'll find out. It's one of those things where I have obviously been pretty skeptical of Kiffin throughout the years. I don't think of Kiffin as being a serious person. And I think that when you want to take that next step as a coach, you've got to be more than just a social media character. You've got to be more than just a famous last name. You've got to have the coaching chops to be able to do it. And I remain skeptical that Kiffin is that guy. But there's no doubt that a year ago, Ole Miss was a real team. Now, they got beaten up pretty bad by Georgia, but coming into Athens and playing in that spot late in the season, that's not an easy thing to do, and it shouldn't be, condemning for Ole Miss. They could not handle that moment. But, winning 10 regular season games, being the factor they were, that's a real accomplishment. And it certainly, puts you in the discussion for being the playoff here this year. So best case scenario, as an 8 seed or a 9 seed, perhaps getting a chance to have a home playoff game, that is what, Ole Miss will be. Worst case scenario, and it always kind of comes back to this for me. For a team that's so transfer laden, they've not recruited, out of high school. That's not something that Lane Kiffin's particularly fond of. They have not recruited particularly well out of high school. This is a very transfer laden team. As you've heard me ask before, what happens when adversity strikes? For relatively new teammates who aren't used to playing with each other, will they still want to support each other when all of a sudden things aren't quite perfect anymore? When you have to dig deep and kind of find something out about yourself and demonstrate something about yourself to somebody else? Oftentimes, teams that don't have any real authentic chemistry, they don't hold up very well in situations like this. And so I've certainly suggested that Ole Miss could be in the playoff. I'm not ready to say if I think they will be or they won't be. But while it's possible, the worst case scenario is by the time they play Georgia in November, they're not even in that conversation at all. And Georgia-Ole Miss is not even a big football game because that's just not what the Rebels are bringing to the table. If we're going to have conversations about which games could perhaps be, more important when they're played than they appear to be, I think you at least have to consider the Ole Miss game could be less important when it's finally played than it appears to be on paper. But it's also a situation where I've gotten plenty wrong about Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss in the past, and maybe I'm set up to be wrong on this again. Only one way to find out about that. Moving to Alabama here for a moment. One of the things you've heard me say about Bama over the course of the last few days is that as you start looking at who really will make the playoff in the SEC, I start to gravitate back towards the fact that Bama does have a coach that's not only been to the playoff, but in 2023, he won a playoff game. Washington got to the national championship, ultimately lost there. And Jalen Milroe, while he didn't play very well at all against Michigan in the Rose Bowl, he was there. He got there. And so for Alabama this year, in comparison to teams like Missouri and Ole Miss who are trying to take big next steps as program, Alabama's trying to just sort of maintain what they have had with a different coach than Nick Saban, but a coach who's been to the playoff and a quarterback in Jalen Milroe who's also been there as well. Ultimately, I think this is one where as we get closer to the season, I am definitely reconsidering Alabama. I probably would have had them out of the playoff early in the offseason. But I think when you start thinking about best case scenario, Bama making the playoff, I don't believe this is a national championship contender, but I do believe it could make the playoff. And, as it stands right now, I believe when I make my official picks, I believe I probably will pick Alabama to make the playoff. I don't know what that means for the Georgia-Bama game in September, how much of a threat Bama could be to win that for Georgia in one of its first big road games of the year. But definitely I'm not as, I think, down on post-Saban Alabama as I would have been a couple of months ago. The experience perhaps matters there just a bit. And then finally, Texas. And I think one of the things you look at when you think about Texas is obviously the transition to the SEC and coming into this league with a little bit of steam. The fact that they won the Big 12 last year for the first time since 2009. They got to the playoff. For the most part, they kind of render an end to the whole, like, Texas is back meme and the funny, responses to Texas fans who sort of always think Texas is going to be better than what you think they're going to be. I think that Texas probably comes into the SEC for the most part, having people think they're ready for this league and ready to be a contender. Let me give you a worst-case scenario here for a moment, though. Look at September 7th for a moment. First big Saturday of the year for the Michigan Wolverines after playing Colorado State to begin the season. But on the road at Michigan. Now, I don't think that Michigan's going to be very good this year. I think they're going to drop off pretty big from where they were at their national championship level a year ago. But what if, with all the questions about how Texas stacks up for the SEC, what if they lose on the road to Michigan? I wouldn't say it's likely to happen, but Michigan is the defending national champions after all. It's at least a possibility. Is there a chance, in other words, that Michigan gets Texas off to a bad start with the entirety of an SEC schedule looming shortly after that? At least have to wonder. Now, the early stage of the SEC schedule, pretty favorable for Texas. Around a game against Georgia, you've got Mississippi State, Oklahoma, and Vanderbilt. Of course, Oklahoma will be a top 25 team. Mississippi State and Vanderbilt pretty bad. And then you're thinking about the likes of Florida, Arkansas, and Kentucky after that. So it's a pretty favorable schedule for Texas in the SEC. Some people are saying it's even a favor to Texas to play that schedule in addition to having to play Georgia with a bunch of other easy-ish type games. What if they stumble there at Michigan? That would certainly be a worst-case scenario for a team in Texas that thinks it probably has some big things it wants to prove in its first year in the SEC. It will make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, as we do on Friday, we'll do our event we like to call our long finish, kind of rolling into the weekend, courtesy of the Finished Long Drink. And normally we try to do some fun stuff here during this spot of the show. And, of course, for us, nothing more fun than welcoming in our good friend Kaylee Mansell as a part of a Kaylee's Corner here on the program here today. Kaylee, thanks for your time, and it's good to talk to you. Getting a little bit of an echo between the two of us here right now, but I'm glad to have you here, and I'm going to give you over the floor. Sometimes when you're here and you're doing this with us, we kind of let you have control of the conversation. You get to ask me questions. I never know what you're going to ask. It's always a fun surprise for me when we do that. But as a way of wrapping things up here on this Friday for our long finish presented by the Finished Long Drink, I want to do that for you here right now. So, Kaylee, the floor is yours for that.
So usually with these segments, it's free response, but today we're going to do a little bit of multiple choice inspired by something that we did on our DawgNation social media.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you 3 scenarios, and you're going to tell me which one of them you would want to happen.
Okay.
All right, the first one for this 2024 season, Georgia can win a 3rd national championship. You, Brandon Adams, can be a season ticket holder for life, or Carson Beck can win the Heisman. If you had to pick one, what would you take?
Well, obviously, I'd take the Georgia championship, right? I mean, I'd love to be in the stadium as a season ticket holder to see it, but ultimately, that's something that would benefit only me, whereas the national championship benefits everyone. And no disrespect to Carson, but I'm going to take the team success over the individual success. So for me, it's got to be Georgia winning another national championship. That would be my answer there on that.
All right, this second set might be a little bit tougher for you. So the first one is Kirby Smart can coach at UGA for another 20 years, no more noon games, or Florida finishes last place in the SEC for the next 10 years.
So it's 10 years of Florida last, or another 20 years of Kirby.
Yeah.
Which, if he's 40, what is he, like 48, 49 right now?
48.
Yeah, 48. It's another 20 years. He's only 68. Saban coached well into his 70s. I believe I'll take Kirby for another 20 years because theoretically, if he's at Georgia for another 20 years, then Florida's going to probably end up having a few more last place finishes to tote with that as it is. So 10 years of Florida being last is pretty tempting because that's probably pretty good for Georgia in the long run. But if you told me I could get another 20 years of Kirby Smart, I'd be pretty happy about that. I believe I'd take that.
So what if the years were changed? What if you only get Kirby at 20 years, but Florida finishes last for 40 years? Does that change your answer?
At that point in time, I got to probably watch Florida finish last for another 40 years. You know, it's one of those things where, like, when you have a chance to just sort of end the rivalry and sort of end the program, maybe you do that. So, yeah, if you gave me 4 decades of Florida finishing last, I might take that. That might be pretty fun.
Be the best 40 years of my life. All right, Brandon, you're on vacation. What are you most looking forward to in your off time?
So, looking forward to being away from work for a few days. That's always a lot of fun. It's one of those things where, like, if I had my way, I just sort of lay around and do nothing, sit by the pool, read, or whatever. Like if I had my way, I would move as little as possible for like 7 days. But my kids do my son and I will play golf together. We'll do a little fishing together. My daughter and I will kind of run around, do all kinds of stuff, go shopping. That's what she wants to do and things like that. So this is like that 1 week out of the year, and I really enjoy this where I get to sort of be about them and whatever they want, and it's like kids get older, right? And so you sort of realize, okay, this is our last vacation where they're going to kind of feel like they're in this kind of, like, I don't want to say kid stage, but, every year of childhood sort of brings a different stage to an end. And so I think for my wife and I both, we want to make sure we kind of maximize those moments. So for me, the next week is really not about me as much as it is trying to spend some time with them and kind of soak them up without the distraction of work, which I love, or the distraction of other things in life, which are probably pretty good too. But just sort of that chance to be with them. That's the stuff that I really want the most out of all of this.
That's really awesome. BA for Dad of the Year.
Well, I appreciate that. Now, in addition to that, I also want to enjoy a Finish Long Drink there as well. And speaking of the Finish Long Drink, they bring the long finish to us here each and every Friday on DawgNation Daily, and we want you to enjoy some Finish Long Drink. If you're hanging out in the Peach State over the course of the next week, how about some peach-flavored version of the Finish Long Drink? Or wherever you are, that's good for you there as well. You can also try the Long Drink Cranberry. As I said yesterday, I know our friend Kaylee Mansell loves that. Long Drink Strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume. Some of the rest of y'all I know love that. Long Drink Zero, no carbs, no sugar. How about the Blue Can? That's the traditional. It's the grapefruit flavor. It's the gin kick. After all these years, that is probably still my favorite. The Long Drink is a great story. It came from Helsinki back in the 1950s when the Summer Games were there. It's been in America for a few years, and really it's been some celebrity investors and some, equity stake owners that have kind of helped make this be a fun experience. Think about like Miles Teller, him from the Top Gun Maverick. Think about Ricky Fowler, the great PGA Tour, very popular PGA Tour golfer. They've been involved in the Finish Long Drink and helping spread the word, and I guess in a roundabout way, so have I. So there you go on that. So make sure you try the Finish Long Drink today. And if you don't know where to pick some up, well, you can find out how online. TheLongDrink.com. That's TheLongDrink.com for a lot more on that. And as we wrap up today, let me just say a sincere thank you. I don't like to be away from work. Certainly don't like to not be here with you. But every now and then, as I said before, it's kind of fun to go be with your family and kind of unplug from work a little bit so you're charged up and ready to go for all the other stuff that's about to go down here. So I take that opportunity and that privilege, very, very seriously. But also knowing that all you show up and you listen to these shows, you're part of that, you kind of give me the freedom and the ability to take a vacation. I certainly appreciate that. And to all the folks who help us work together to put these shows together while I'm not here, you just heard from Kaylee Mansell, Cody Chaffins, got Danny helping us out. Jay Black's been back there making sure everything runs smoothly. A lot of people doing a lot of good work for us. And plus all of our guests who kind of rearranged their schedule to do some extra stuff with us. Just really appreciative of everyone who's made this version of DawgNation Daily here this week go smoothly. We'll be back live on Monday, but before we go, one more reminder, Gator Hater Updater. How about 1,301 days? That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia, and that's a great note to end the week. DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger. We'll see you back here live on Monday. Everybody, talk to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. So the next time you hear my voice, you'll be hearing it in a live format. That means live comments back together once again here too. And as you just heard me say, I'll echo it again here right now. Big time thank you. I always get a little nostalgic, about these kinds of shows, these kinds of weeks, because it feels like, you can kind of think about, sort of previous vacation weeks that we've done over the years and things like that. And it's a nice thing to be able to kind of pause and reflect and just realize that I feel very, very lucky to be able to do this show, to to speak to you each and every day, and I'm genuinely excited about the fact that I get to come back and do it again on Monday. You always want to have one of those jobs where you don't have that like sort of, Sunday scary sort of dread about coming back to work. I don't have any of that. I'm very, very excited. Love being off, but also love coming back to work too. And so that's always a really good thing. So thank you for the role that you play in making that true for me. Also, make sure you find our friends R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Water heater, if it needs replacing, in many cases, they can replace it for you the same day. If you want to get that air conditioning unit tuned up and keeping you nice and cool all summer long, or if you've got a plumbing emergency or electrical emergency, something like that, our friends at R.S. Andrews, they got you covered on all of that. So please find them online at rsandrews.com. Have a great weekend, everyone. I'll see you back here Monday. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then.